Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's request comes from patron JimJam78, who wanted me to take a look at a science fiction short story called The Screwfly Solution. Its author is a woman of many names. Her given name was Alice Hastings Sheldon, but the name she used for most of her published works was James Tiptree Jr., with the occasional short story like today's published under the feminine pen name Raccoona Sheldon. The Screwfly Solution came out in 1977, so it was about halfway through her literary career. About the author. Alice Sheldon was born Alice Bradley to a pair of intellectual parents in Chicago, Illinois in 1915. Her father was a naturalist and lawyer, while her mother was an author of both fiction and nonfiction, and they made many trips to Africa as a family while Alice was growing up. She then went to a Swiss finishing school, a New York boarding school, and then an all-female college, which she dropped out of when she eloped with a man named Bill Davy. And since I've called her Alice Sheldon twice now, you've probably figured out that this first marriage didn't end well. The two divorced after 6 years of marriage in 1940, at which point Alice was supporting herself as a painter and graphic artist. During World War II, Alice joined the Army Air Force as an intelligence officer, and as the war wound down, she met and married her second husband, Huntington D. Sheldon. After the war, Alice Sheldon worked for the CIA for a little while, but she went back to college and eventually got a doctorate in experimental psychology in 1967. At the same time, she submitted a few science fiction stories under the pen name James Tiptree Jr., partly because academics like her weren't supposed to stoop to something as base as science fiction, and partly because science fiction publishing was even more of a men's club than it is today. However, Sheldon wouldn't get any stories published until 1968. Her writing career then continued until her death in 1987. As James Tiptree, Sheldon wrote a lot of short stories with strong feminist themes, but it wasn't until a decade into her career that her fans figured out that she was a woman. She continued writing under the name afterwards, but once her identity was confirmed, she became more open about her life and history. This includes her sexual orientation. Apparently, she was bisexual with a preference for women. However, it's her history with psychology that has the biggest impact on today's subject. The review. Alan is an American biologist who is in Colombia to use the Screwfly solution to get rid of parasitic canefly populations. Said solution is to create a group of sterile females, dope them with breeding pheromones, and then release them into the wild so that male screwflies will breed with them instead of fertile females. Do this for a couple of generations, and the fly population will drop below the viability threshold. Meanwhile, Alan's neighbor and mentor, Dr. Bernard, has created a chemical that causes spruce budworm moths to mate the wrong way round, effectively creating a safe, targeted pesticide. However, something strange is going on with the human population. Men in certain regions are starting to believe that it is right and proper to rape and murder all the women they come across. And while initially there is some concern raised by governments and the United Nations, this concern quietly goes away as this belief spreads. Alan initially rushes home to protect his wife Anne, but during the trip back, he realizes that he too has been infected by this belief. He warns his wife to stay away from him, but when his teenage daughter goes to see him, despite all the warnings, he kills her, and then he kills himself. Anne goes into hiding as the femicide mania continues to grow, but just before she gives up on living, she sees a glowing alien taking soil samples. It would seem that, rather than invading by force, the aliens decided to apply the Screwfly solution to humanity. Much cleaner that way. Less property damage. While there are a few bits and pieces of direct narration, the Screwfly solution is mainly an epistolary story, one that's told as if it's a collection of journals, letters, and articles. The story doesn't always telegraph when it jumps between letters and direct narration, but it's easy enough to figure out based on context clues, so that's only a minor complaint. And something else this structure makes clear is that this isn't really a story about Alan and Anne. It's a story about the death of the human species, and Alan and Anne are mostly present to make things more personal. Incidentally, that death is based on a distressingly realistic facet of human biology. All male animals on Earth of a sufficient complexity have a strong connection between aggression and sexual reproduction. Among other things, this explains why the vast majority of serial killers are men. What this alien chemical does is basically turn all men into serial killers, who are compelled to kill those they find sexually attractive, including other men in some cases. It also causes men to see nothing wrong with this behavior, both in themselves and in others. And it ramps up their aggression to the point where they have to act if they become aroused to any degree. They also come up with religious justifications for their actions, but that's more of a symptom than a cause. Overall, the Screwfly solution is short, to the point, and surprisingly harrowing. It's one of those stories that remind you just how fragile the human brain is, and how dependent we are on hormones and chemicals that, if they become imbalanced, can completely change our personalities and our actions. The story is part of the Out of the Everywhere collection, and I strongly recommend giving the whole thing a read. The analysis. The idea that the human brain can be so easily controlled is a disturbing thought, but that's not the most disturbing aspect of the story. The most disturbing aspect is that connection between male aggression and male libido, and the fact that when both get supercharged during the story, the female population resorts to some very familiar tactics. In the middle of the story, as Alan is flying home, he has a stopover in Miami. There he notices that the women in the airport who had flaunted their sexuality not so long ago were now dressed in bulky clothing to conceal their femininity. Later on, they try to pass themselves off as young men, or they avoid going out in public altogether. These tactics are very reminiscent of various societies, past and present, where women are only allowed to wear loose robes, are forced to wear face-concealing masks, or are not allowed to be seen by visitors even within their own households. And why are they made to do this? Because if a woman displays her femininity, then she is responsible for the aggressive actions of the men who see her. Don't get me wrong, this aspect of human biology can and should be fought against. On a societal level with laws, on a cultural level with communication across the gender divide, and on a personal level by holding yourself to a standard and by raising your kids to maintain that standard. But at the same time, we need to understand what we're up against. The connection between male aggression and libido transcends culture, transcends humanity itself. It's common throughout the animal kingdom. However, humans are complex social animals, and our actions are not dictated solely by instinct. We can do better than that. And so long as alien pesticides aren't messing with our brains, we can curtail male aggression without having to restrict women's freedoms. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.